Hey Jeff, do you have the guts to put up your spooks?
I have the spooks to put up my guts.
Shit. This week's theme...
Comic books. This is sort of our Comic-Con special. I am presenting an episode of Tales from the Crypt from Season 2, number 13, called Korman's Kalamity. So, this episode starts with the Crypt Keeper, and I don't know how much you saw of this, Ryan. I don't know if you were watching this in a little window on your computer while you were at work.
Indeed I was.
So, did you see that the Crypt Keeper was making a recursive illustration?
What does that mean?
The Crypt Keeper was drawing a picture of
himself.
The Crypt Keeper drawing a picture of a Crypt
Oh.
Keeper drawing a picture.
I saw him drawing a picture of a Crypt Keeper, but I didn't see the third level of Crypt Keeping.
What's kind of cool about that opening visual is that Tales from the Crypt on HBO was adapting stories that started as comic book stories.
Indeed, yeah.
And the story they're adapting is about a comic book artist. And so this is like the most weirdly recursive episode of Tales from the Crypt.
Yeah, it's cool.
It's a real Ouroboros, which is a snake eating its own ass.
I wonder how many of the illustrations we saw therein were from the actual books.
I feel like the covers they show you are from the books because, you know, they licensed the story and the art and all that. But
do you think those were the real Tales from the Crypt offices, or do you think it was a soundstage?
Well, I'll get into it, and
okay.
And then we should talk about that, because
Yeah.
it is kind of curious. So our story begins with Harry Anderson, beloved actor of Night Court fame.
And It fame.
Oh, that's right. He was in the TV version of It. And so it opens with the song Just My Imagination, which is a pretty epic needle drop
Yeah.
for an episodic television. And he is in the Tales from the Crypt comic book offices, and he is illustrating a story, which is another turn on the recursive loop. So it's a Tales from the Crypt episode based on Tales from the Crypt comic about a guy who works in the Tales from the Crypt offices making comics. I don't know. I like that sort of thing. Anyway, so he's there. He's working hard on some kind of, monster drawing or some kind of monster attack, and he's kind of struggling with it. And I'm going to introduce a new criteria for review.
Twist.
Because you had previously mentioned Dutch angles and things like that, the kind of things you look out for. And we talked about this in a previous episode, about how terrible the relationships and namely the wives are in these stories. And so the new criteria is how long until the awful wife shows up. And I'm going to call this time to shrew. And the time to shrew in this episode was 2 minutes and 45 seconds.
These poor 80s wives of these horrible 80s writers.
Yeah. And actually, I think it was long-suffering 50s wives from 50s writers, because a lot of these Tales from the Crypt stories were all penned in the 50s. And
yeah, I wonder how many of the wives appeared in the actual books.
Well, I was wondering, yet again we were getting this really heavy, weird 50s influence in the music and the costuming and the dialogue. And I was like, what is with this weird 50s flavor? And I looked it up. Tales from the Crypt ran from 1950 to 1955.
Oh, not a long time.
Yeah, but because or EC Comics, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I thought it was defunct by the time the show was going.
EC Comics, which published Tales from the Crypt, ran from 50 to 55. And because this guy works at the Tales from the Crypt, everything is kind of 50s.
Pseudo 50s. We'll have to go and research this episode's basis and see if there's a shrew wife.
Oh, the story wouldn't work without it. So anyway.
I guess that's true.
Harry Anderson plays Jim Korman. And like I said, he's stuck on the comic. He's working over the weekend. 2 minutes and 45 seconds later, shrew wife arrives and berates him for not coming home accuses him of philandering with the secretary, makes fun of his job, calls him a loser, calls their marriage a waste, and finally, to top it all off, mocks him for not being fertile.
It's not enough that you gotta draw these dumb cartoons instead of getting a real job, but you can't even keep your paws off the secretaries in this goddamned office. I gave the best years of my life, and for what? A stingy, two-timing loser. You can't even give me children, you little wimp.
She busts him for not taking his fertility pills. And he complains that they're experimental and they may have unknown side effects. He says they're making his imagination fertile. But he relents and he takes the pill and he angrily sketches what I'm calling a Battletoad. You remember the Battletoads?
Oh, yeah.
Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Totally radical.
Okay. But I like that he's on these experimental boner meds and they're giving his imagination a boner. So, when his imagination has a boner, he draws a Battletoad eating a dude. Hard cut to a late night laundromat, and Jim's doing laundry. He sees a lady and kind of gives her a wink on his way out. And soon after, the power goes out, and a switchblade-wielding redneck comes in, immediately intent on doing terrible things to this woman. She pulls out a police badge. He doesn't care. She gives him a judo throw, but doesn't finish him off.
She gives him the judo throw, and then he stands right up and says, "That's going to cost you.
Yeah,
Surely you couldn't do that again."
That Bruce Lee stuff is going to cost you. I'm going to make you pay for that. That's when the Battletoad that Jim Korman was drawing earlier emerges from a washing machine, grabs the guy, and bites his head off. So then we are treated to another hard cut. It's the homicide scene. And the cops are all standing around, bagging up the body. They don't believe her. And the next day, she's in her cop outfit. She's walking the beat. And she sees a newsstand with all the Tales from the Crypts. And not only does she recognize the cover with Battletoad coming out of a washing machine, but also all the previous issues match the weird calls they've been getting. She finds his name on the cover and rushes off, and we are treated to our first comic book page wipe, which was a nice touch. So later, Jim is drawing a monstrous version of his wife after an angry phone call, and little does he know, it's manifesting in the shadows of the office. We see this thing coming into existence. And he kind of looks at the sketch, and he's like, meh. He crumples it up, and it fades. The monster vanishes. He leaves. He gets in his car, and the lady cop is waiting in the backseat of his car. And he turns around and he's like, "It's you." He recognizes it from the laundromat, which makes me wonder how she tracked him down, found his car, broke into her car, but didn't know who it was. I don't know.
She saw the label on his undies.
There you go. So she tells him about the monster appearing in the laundromat, and she wants to test the theory that his drawings are come to life. And he's like, "All right, I think it's crazy, but you're hot, so I'll do it."
Yeah, he immediately tries to philander.
Yeah. And so he's like, "What do you want me to draw?" And she's like, "Something repulsive." Why not a kitten? Something harmless. Or why not $1 million? The chemistry between them builds, and he tries to kiss her, but she demurs. And when he asks why, she says, "I know nothing about you, but that you draw horrible things," which is accurate.
Yeah, fair.
She's a great detective,
but she wants it still.
She's
very clear.
Man, there is chemistry between them. Maybe she's just.
I think she's just super horny from too much time on the job.
Maybe she's super horny.
Because otherwise,
she's enamored that he inadvertently saved her from a switchblade wielding redneck. But also, he's taking experimental virility medicine, and I don't know if it's someone's coming through his pores.
Oh,
yeah,
that's true. Because he can manifest his own desires.
Yeah. So anyhow,
shit. He
says well, if you don't like me drawing horrible things, I'll change careers right now. I'll start drawing romance. And then she's like, "Okay, I'm in." They start macking. My next note is that this episode is ridiculous. How quickly things are moving. So cut to a group of kids playing in a warehouse. the repulsive monster that he drew is this cool webbed up slime monster. It emerges from an old refrigerator and really puts the spook on these kids. So the lady cop calls him up and was like, hey, you're never going to believe what happened. That monster you drew, it showed up. He's like, oh yeah? Why don't you tell me over a candlelit dinner? And she's like, all right. And he puts down the phone. He's feeling very satisfied with himself. Little did he realize that his shrew wife was standing there and she heard it all. He's stone cold busted. She's like, I'm going to go get something from the car. He's like, yeah, whatever. And he starts drawing that monster version of his wife again. She comes back with a giant hand cannon and is going to blow him away when the monster wife manifests. And it's a horrible monster that looks like her, but is wearing like the same outfit. And the real wife can't help herself. She just, even though I think the monster wife is kind of bent on attacking
Harry,
and it would have been kind of poetic justice if he had been killed by the monster wife.
Poetic something.
But instead she cannot help herself, and she just starts ripping on this monster and insulting it.
Well, that's flattering. Is that how you picture me, Jim, as a rancid heap of garbage? God, what an eyesore. Why don't you feed it a laxative and put it out of its misery? Try some skin lotion, zit-face. Your complexion could scare a proctologist.
To the point where the monster gets offended and attacks her, and they start fighting, and Jim is like, ho ho, these two terrible women deserve each other. Throws away the magic boner pills, leaves to go on the date, and with his wife mutilated, he can live happily ever after.
Yeah.
And that's the episode.
Yeah, as you were saying earlier, don't throw away the boner pills. Use them to create millions of dollars and lots of kittens for yourself and your new love interest.
So, yeah, I've been thinking about this, and I guess the sweet thing about it is that he was such a put-upon guy, and his wife was such a hideous shrew, that even though he had almost godlike power to rewrite reality, all he wanted was a loving partner.
Yeah.
And once he had that, he's like, I'm content. I'm throwing away these magic boner pills.
That's very nice.
You know, he wasn't like, oh, I'm going to draw hot women and do lots of philandering. He just wanted that one soulmate. Who
he's known for one day.
Yeah.
I kept thinking the whole time, like, okay, well, how long until he sees this one as a horrible shrew? Because it's always nice at first. Probably his relationship with his wife was all fun and games at first, too, until a couple years went down, and then she became a quote-unquote hideous shrew monster. So he's got the butterflies now for old Lady Detective, but in a year or so, he's going to get tired of her, and he's going to start drawing her as a monster.
We don't know that.
His true wife was the drawings.
Yeah, perhaps. The love of comic book illustration. But I feel like Lady Cop is smart, capable, independent. Like, she has her own thing going on. She doesn't need him.
Extremely vulnerable.
Vulnerable to
the advances of a Harry... What's his name?
Are you talking about the redneck with the switchblade?
Harry Dean Morgan?
What's Jim Korman?
No, Jim Korman.
Well, again, it does raise the question.
He is sex on a stick, but...
Does she have free will in this situation?
Right, and in which case,
because
that thing is going to
their
collapse.
relationship ended with a shot that perfectly mirrored the romance comic he was drawing.
Yeah, yep. Or their relationship began with a shot.
Yeah, the relationship began. The last shot we saw matched what he drew. So
that's true. Yep.
I do wonder if she had free will.
Now that those pills are gone, that's it, man. She's going to see him for what he truly is.
Perhaps.
An impotent loser.
And she'll probably be called in to investigate the brutal murder of his wife.
And he never crumpled up the monster drawing, so that monster is just going to be rampaging around the office.
You know, the wife did shoot the monster a couple times with that giant hand cannon. We don't know if it was fatal or if that monster is born of pure imagination.
And
does that
the
monster
other two
come
monsters
from an alternate dimension where comics are real?
By the way, the horrible shrew wife character in this episode didn't fit at all with the rest of the tone. She was so wildly cartoonish. She was like storming in, hands on the hips. The only thing she didn't do was like whomp him with a rolling pin.
Yeah.
And everyone else was pretty straight.
She was
real two-dimensional.
Yeah. She was written that way, so I feel like the actress was just trying to knock it out of the park, and she did. She kind of made the best out of a bad situation. But you just kind of blew my mind, because she was such a two-dimensional, cartoonish, shrewish person, and we know that Jim Korman had been on those magic boner pills for a while.
Oh, it's possible he manifested her that.
He changed her?
Yes, I do.
Because, and that's kind of like that episode of Rick and Morty where Beth and Jerry go to that marriage counseling place, and they put on the helmets that kind of creates their psychic version of each other. And I wonder if that's what he did to her.
Yep. I think he probably did.
Wow.
Levels upon levels upon
levels.
Biff. Pow. My submission is an episode of Are You Afraid of the Dark? Entitled The Tale of the Ghastly Grinner. Boing. I gotta put that sound effect transition in there.
So in the beginning of this episode, the Midnight Society is having a problem with starting the fire because the logs are wet. And one of the girls is like, here, let me do it. She grabs 2 sticks, and she just rubs them against each other and starts this huge fiery blaze.
I feel like the fiery blaze was started by magic. There's so much magic going on in the Midnight Society this night.
There?
Tucker brings a comic randomly, and it just so happens that Betty Ann's story is about comics. And unless they colluded it beforehand.
Look, the Midnight Society
Tucker always has comics.
Has hundreds of stories. So that could just be a coincidence.
It could
she's
be.
like, oh, that reminds me of a story or a theory about comic books.
And then she's like...
That's not magical.
And then she's like, comics come from the mind or whatever. And as soon as she says it, the fire flares up.
I think the real magic is that girl...
2 sticks rubbing together.
Presumably those sticks are
logs.
just as damp as the logs that won't light. And she rubs those sticks together, and you and I know it is not easy to start a friction fire.
Also, you don't rub sticks together to start fire.
Oh, not like
It's
that.
just not how you do it.
There's one method called the fire plow, and it is very specific, and it's you rub one stick inside of another stick, and she was not using the fire plow. So, as a woodsman, I found that terrible bushcraft.
It ruined the whole episode for you.
I'm not going to lie. I was very upset about it.
Also of note, in the intro of this episode, one thing DJ McHale said, he said one of the few notes that Nickelodeon ever gave them was don't show the kids starting the fire, because they didn't want to teach little kids in the audience how to start fires.
Oh, is that why they did that bullshit thing with the sticks?
They're trying to start the fire, which I was like, whoa, holy shit! Lies! They did it
in a way that
I guess
would
they didn't
never
show
work.
any matches or anything,
I guess
and then
maybe that's why.
Still, they were really
teach
towing the
kids a
line
friction
there.
fire.
Really pushing it. So, Ethan is an aspiring comic book artist. He's pretty crappy. I guess he's about the level I was when I was his age.
Is he crappy?
Of art. He's pretty crappy. He's not, like, kindergarten level, but his drawings are nothing special.
Huh.
I mean, they're fine.
I don't know. They had a certain Uncas vibe to them.
Yeah, well.
2 things. One is I could have sworn that kid was Homer, the child vampire from Near Dark. I had to look it up, and boy, they look similar, but they are not.
Ethan has been rejected by every comic book publisher that he has submitted his artwork to, probably because he's a middle school level artist. And he comes home in a rage after getting his fistful of rejection letters. He tears all his artwork off the walls. He thinks he's just the worst loser. He should consider washing his hair once in a while. It might make people think he's less of a loser.
He was so goth.
He was so
goth.
Yeah, so greasy. But in the detritus of his rage, he finds a very bespoke invitation telling him to come to the grand opening of this comic book shop. And so he does, because he's wicked bored. So he gets to the comic book shop, and he's browsing around. There's nobody in there. And some lady pops up out of nowhere, and she's totally radical and punk with her leather jacket and her short bleach blonde hair. And in this comic book shop, there are X-Men and Spider-Man and Superman, and I don't know if they bothered buying licenses for these images.
I made a note about that as well. Also, in the Tales from the Crypt episode, there was a Jabba the Hutt.
Wow, yeah.
There was all kinds of property, intellectual property, just throughout.
Willy-nilly.
Even the titular comic book, which you're about to mention, had a Marvel Comics logo
Really?
on it. Yes. I paused it and double-checked.
Doubtful. Highly doubtful
doubtful?
that Marvel Comics would have published
Yes.
The Tale of the Ghastly Grinner. And in amongst the real comics, there's a fish man and a slime man or something, and she's trying to sell, this comic shop lady's trying to sell Ethan these crappy comics that nobody wants to buy, and he's not interested. So she's like, whatever, what the fuck are you doing here, Cakes? She doesn't know him, she gives him the name Cakes, and he says, well, I got this invitation, and she's like, whoa, holy shit, it's you. I can't believe it. Where's the art? Where's the art? Show me the art. And he's like, well, how did you know I was an artist? He's got a real squeaky voice, I'm not doing it justice. And she goes, word gets around, Cakes. That's it. That's the only explanation for how she's heard about him, how she knows he's an artist, how any of this is happening. So he shows her the art, and he's like, man, I really suck. I'm just no good. I'm going to quit and work at a gas station. She says, don't let the Zoomers get you down, Cakes. They don't know what they're talking about. And then she pauses and says, oh my god, you're a little rough around the edges, Cakes. But you got the makings of a young Uncas. And he's like, what? And she says, Sylvester Uncas, you've never heard of him. He only did one comic book, and then he vanished. But he's one of the greats. And she shows him The Tale of the Ghastly Grinner, which is Sylvester Uncas's comic book. And it was so evil that he decided to do only one more episode, The Death of the Ghastly Grinner. But he didn't finish it before he vanished. And so as a prize for Ethan being awesome, she gives him the only existing copy of Ghastly Grinner comic book. So he gets home, he's loving it. He goes to school the next day, and he's supposed to be reading his science book, but he's reading the Ghastly Grinner, and the teacher finds it and says, you little bastard, how dare you. He takes the comic book, and he's about to dunk it in the fish tank, and Ethan says, that's one of a kind. And the teacher says, correction, it's none of a kind.
You can't, it's one of a kind.
Correction, it's none of a kind.
I made a note about that. Really good writing in that episode. Like really
sharp
punchy,
dialogue,
really funny, kind of good quippy writing.
Oh yeah, well yeah, punchy like a comic book, I guess.
Also, in that science class, the teacher was demonstrating this giant
microwaves,
prism-powered microwave thing that explodes a hot dog. And then he takes the comic book, and I was like, oh, he's going to put the comic book in the microwave exploder. And maybe that's going to be important later. And she just puts it in the fish tank.
Puts it in the fish
that
tank.
they hadn't established. Very strange.
So he gets it home, and he decides that he's going to put it in the microwave to dry it out, which is not how microwaves work, really. I mean, I guess it would get warm.
Well, the teacher was
maybe
telling
evaporate.
him about how water molecules are the things that microwaves
Okay, well,
target.
so good on you, Ethan. He was paying attention, but his parents,
I was too.
His parents, who are horrible, slobbish, disgusting people, except they're very nice to him. They're like, teacher said you were giving him crap at school. One more report like this, and you're not going to be reading any more of them comic books. They're addictive, and then they go back to watching TV. Ethan puts the book in the microwave, and then a phone rings, and his mom says, Ethan, it's for you. It's a girl. And it's this horrible nerd girl from his class, whose name, for all of these years, I thought was Hooper B. Calero. Like B was her middle initial. Her name's actually Hooper Picalero. Her last name is Picalero, and I only just learned that, so goddamn. Like, I've been quoting in my brain for years, Hooper Picalero.
Quoting to yourself?
For some reason, just because she says it over and over again.
I know, but you just quote it to yourself?
Yeah, it just runs through my mind every now and again.
Is this why you can't sleep?
So, probably. So, Hooper Picalero calls him and says, it's just really gross what Mr. Wrightson did to you. And he's like, yeah, thanks, gee whiz. And then the whole thing explodes. Ethan comes down, he finds his comic with a giant hole in the middle, and as he's airing it out, a Ghastly Grinner-shaped hole in the kitchen door. And then he's like, Mom, what the hell happened? And she comes in and she's like, don't you worry, Ethan. just have a smile, or whatever. And then she starts laughing maniacally, and blue goo comes out of her mouth. His dad comes up behind him. He's also got blue goo coming out of his mouth, and they're all laughing like crazy. And so he runs outside, he hides behind the bushes, and Hooper Picolero's there. She's like coming up to talk to him in person. I don't know, she's like really got the Jones for Ethan. And he like grabs her and pulls her down behind the bush, and she says, I don't have much of a sense of humor. And then her parents go to Ethan's house, because apparently they're friends with his parents, even though they don't really know each other. And they're like, come on in, meet Uncle Jake, or whatever they call him. And Ethan's like, I don't have a Uncle Jake. And so Hooper Picolero's parents get Ghastly Grinnered as well, with the blue goo.
At this time, he's trying to explain about the Ghastly Grinner and this comic book that came to life. And he looks into the ruins of the comic book, and there's pictures of them inside the comic book.
Has that already happened?
Yeah. And so inside the comic book, he can see pictures of his parents and
getting Grinnerized,
and her parents
right.
Grinnerized, which is weird.
Well, the worlds are colliding at this
yeah.
point. It is weird because later he has to complete the comic book. It doesn't just automatically happen. Right. They get on a bus. And they're reading the comic book and they're seeing all that stuff, and then they see the bus driver who's also blue gooified, and he cranks his head around just like in the pilot episode with the cab driver, and he starts laughing like a crazy person. And then they pull the emergency brake, and the bus driver slams headfirst into the front windshield, most likely dying, although I guess his head already whipped all the way around, so neck's probably broken. They get off the bus, they go to the comic book shop, and then Punk Lady starts explaining to them about how Sylvester Uncas disappeared. They need Ethan to finish the book. And just at that moment, the Ghastly Grinner arrives and grabs Punk Lady in a chokehold and lifts her off the ground. So Hooper Picolero and Ethan run out of there. And Hooper Picolero is like super smart, so she knows, and she sees like the microwaves in the book. So she somehow figures out that microwaves are the key to destroying the Ghastly Grinner. So they go to the science room, and they close the door, and in the window at the top of the door, some like blue goo starts coming down. So I guess the Grinner is like on the ceiling, like hovering above, so that he can spit his blue saliva goo down the window.
Yeah, he's always around.
He always knows exactly where they are. Maybe he follows the comic book.
And the first couple victims, you don't see him at all. You just see his victims.
Yeah, you see the aftermath.
But, we didn't see him nab the bus driver, and yet, it happened real quick.
It happened. Someone comes up to the door, and they're like, hide! But it's the science teacher, Mr. Wright's in. And he's like, yeah, I hope you assholes have a good explanation for this, you little fucks! But then the Ghastly Grinner grabs him, and turns around, and he's, and the blue goo comes out of his mouth, and they're like, no! And then I think they shoot him with the microwave oven.
They do. They disassemble that giant prism-powered microwave we saw in the beginning, but it has no effect.
Okay, no effect. And then I guess Ethan figures out he has to finish the comic book, so he, writes himself into the comic.
So they run back to the comic book store.
And he's drawing furiously.
He's trying to complete Uncas's issue to
Death of the Ghastly Grinner. And then he gets sucked into the comic book. Him and the Ghastly Grinner.
Well, the Ghastly Grinner shows up at the comic book store and is attacking Hooper B. Picolero.
Oh yeah, he's holding her braids.
Yep.
Out to the side.
Trying to Grinnerize her.
Need a good laugh or something.
But she doesn't have much of a sense of humor. Previously, she had stuffed her ears with paper to prevent hearing the Ghastly Grinner.
Oh yeah.
But then she just did that for 5 minutes and then took him out.
Yeah.
But she was protected by her lack of sense of humor?
Oh yeah, so he I guess so. So Ethan's just drawing the comic, and then he rushes the Ghastly Grinner.
And then he runs at the Ghastly Grinner, and then they both collide and get sucked into the now
comic.
Finished comic.
Or being finished in real time. And it's pretty cool because then Hooper B. Calero is watching the book, and you're hearing the action sequence, and it's all done in audio, and it's pretty neat. It's an inventive way to get an action scene without having to spend any money or have stunts.
They do recycle some of the illustrations with different levels, though.
Yeah. So she's hearing them fight. I'll get you, or whatever. And no, I'm Super Ethan. He draws himself as a superhero, but his superhero name is just Ethan. And he has a big E on his chest.
I guess once he took off that horrible goth rag, he was somewhat more potent.
They figure out microwaves didn't work in my world, but they will in yours, so they get the... Oh, they find Sylvester Uncas in the comic book. Comic book lady is also in there somehow. They get a microwave inside the comic book, and they zap the Ghastly Grinner. Microwaves, no! And he disappears, and they're like, a job well done. Way to go, Cakes. I always knew you could do it. But then the Ghastly Grinner's still alive, and he pops up behind them. And then Ethan goes, Hooper!
So she busts out her
giant eraser for big mistakes, which was established earlier, even though she's like a super genius, even she makes mistakes. And she just erases the Grinner's face, and it destroys him, and Ethan, comic book lady, and Sylvester Uncas emerge from the comic book, and Sylvester Uncas hands Ethan his drawings and says, I think these belong to you. And then cut to the grand release party of Ethan's comic book, Ethan, quote unquote, which is like a smash success, even though it's the same crappy middle school art, and it's a superhero called Ethan.
And Hooper B. Piccolero is dressed in that same horrible goth smock.
She's like his manager or something at this point, and his parents are like soaking up all the attention and accolades.
Yeah, which was a slightly Grinnerized kind of way to be, I guess. They don't look normal.
Well, they cleaned up a little bit for the cameras, but they weren't spouting blue goo out of their mouths. Then, Ethan lives happily ever after. He and Hooper Piccolero probably smash. And then we go out to the Midnight Society, and something that always happens, she says, Sylvester Uncas never drew another comic book again. They're always ending their stories by saying, like, the door never worked again. He never drew another comic again. But Ethan got his just desserts, or whatever she says.
It's just desserts.
It's some comic pun, I'm sure.
As for Ethan, well, you might say he finally made it into the comics.
They kind of established like 1,000 different ways you could possibly defeat the Ghastly Grinner, and none of them work, but just erasing him did work. But if that was the case, then the unfinished drawings probably should have also had some sort of an effect on his power levels or something.
It was very strange.
The rules were a little all over the place.
And also, the punk daughter of Sylvester Uncas lured Ethan to her comic book store under false pretenses.
Yeah,
because
potentially to his doom.
His art style was close enough to her father's that she thought, even though the Ghastly Grinner was so evil and probably abducted her father, she wanted him to complete the issue, the death of the Ghastly Grinner, in the hopes of getting her father back from his theorized dimension of comic books. But she must have known that was at risk of unleashing the Ghastly Grinner.
She didn't know he was going to put it in a fish tank and then the microwave.
But she believed that finishing the comic book would bring her father back.
True.
And that there was somehow a revolving door from our world into the comic book world. So she must have known that the Ghastly Grinner could come through. And so the Ghastly Grinner is running around and he's like sucking the emotion out of people, except for Uncas and the punk daughter, which he physically abducted into the comic book world.
Maybe he just was like stashing them for later. Or maybe because they were a threat to him, he had to put them... He couldn't just leave them lying around. He had to put them somewhere where they couldn't...
Couldn't he have just Grinnerized them?
I guess he could have Grinnerized them, but then they'd still be out in the real world where he's vulnerable. In his comic book,
he's not vulnerable in the real world. He's only vulnerable inside the comic book
He's
dimension.
vulnerable inside the comic book to people from outside the comic book.
Yes,
who can
but
erase
only
him.
while he is...
But if they're inside the comic book and he's inside the comic book, nothing they can do can stop him. Or if they're inside the comic book and he's outside of the comic book... If they're inside of the comic book, nothing they can do can stop him. But if they're outside of the comic book, there is a chance that he can be stopped.
Yeah, it was
because he has to
pretty
subscribe
complex
to eraser physics.
Yes.
I know. I'll leave you with a
Ratings for Korman's Calamity episode of Tales from the Crypt. I'm going to say the scare factor, low.
Low.
Even if you adjust for Tales from the Crypt and call it shock factor, still pretty low.
Still pretty low.
Gross factor, we definitely had some gore.
Yeah.
Because we had the Battletoad biting that dude's head off, and then we see his severed head.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of original custom
Creatures.
monster costumes.
I've seen grosser.
I've seen grosser, but that
Gross factor's like a medium.
That web-covered slime monster that came out of the fridge, it was pretty cool.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a real EC Comics kind of stylized gross.
It also had slime.
For the what the factor, I guess I'm no longer bumped by the hyperspeed plots of these episodes.
Yeah.
Which just boom, boom, boom. But the shrew wife, who was just like a total cartoon character, gave me a little bit of the what the factor.
Yeah.
Theme. Comic books were being made. Comic books were in the wraparound. The method of the horror manifesting was comic books. So I'd say on theme.
Yeah.
Pretty high.
Yep.
What do you think?
Tale of the Ghastly Grinner.
Scare factor.
Scare factor, high for youngins.
Really high.
Your parents are getting fucked up and zombified. There's like the Ghastly Grinner's jumping out from everywhere. The bus driver could be like a little scary if you're a tiny little kid.
I think if you were a kid, that bus driver thing really would have messed
with
me
the
up.
way their like makeup was done and everything, it was pretty ghoulish.
And it was almost aggressive. Like the Ghastly Grinner was attacking people at such a breakneck speed. Literally breakneck, because the bus driver's bus turned, his head turns around.
Yep.
That was pretty scary.
Yeah.
Just his makeup and his face.
Yeah, he was also yellow, which is an upsetting color to humans.
Yellow is really gross. Speaking of gross factor.
Gross factor high. Nobody likes saliva.
All right, what the factor? It was fairly straightforward in that they think that the Ghastly Grinner is so evil he couldn't finish the comic, but I think he pulled my father into his world, and then surprise, surprise, you put the comic book on the microwave, which is ridiculous, but it's well established, and then he comes out in our world. None of that stuff was surprising. But when they tried the microwaves on him in our world, and it doesn't work, and then they go into the comic book because the microwaves will work there,
and it still doesn't
work. Like, I feel like that's where the what the factor starts to
kick into overdrive.
Yeah.
Also, the fact that Ethan could possibly be a hit comic book writer.
Theme.
Comic books, 100%.
Yeah, as high as the theme was in Tales from the Crypt. Even though the comic book illustration is making monsters come alive, the real magic behind it all are the boner
pills. Yeah.
Whereas in Are You Afraid of the Dark, they posit that there is a separate dimension of comic books.
That's where all the ideas are coming from.
Where the ideas come from, and you can go back and forth. So I gotta give the edge on.
Yeah, and they're reading their adventures in a comic book.
Yeah.
Altering things, yeah.
So I'd say on every factor except for gross factor, I give it to Are You Afraid of the Dark?
I think it looks like a win in the Rye column for once in the last several episodes.
But Time to Shrew, definitely going to give that to Tales from the Crypt. So here's a question: if you had these magic boner pills, and I'm not saying you need magic boner pills, and anything you drew would manifest or become true, pop into reality, what would you draw?
I'd probably draw a house.
If you did not draw this house to perfect architectural precision, would the house be unstable?
Well, as long as the intent of the drawing was a stable house, then it would probably work by magic.
Like monster physics?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Draw a monster house?
And it could be a magic house that has like magic portals and doors.
Yeah.
And you could, like, teleport wherever you wanted to go through the doors.
I mean, what were the limits of these boner pose?
As far as I know, nothing. Perhaps the whole universe was in his imagination. And also, I'd draw, like, some sort of talking immortal pet that was, like, part fox and part werewolf, but didn't want to eat me or anything.
And what would you name this?
Foxwolf.
Immortal talking Foxwolf?
I would name it Beauregard.
Okay.
What would you draw, Jeff?
You know, I think I would be cautious. I would start out with maybe things like money or gold bars. Probably stuff that couldn't be traced.
Sure, yeah.
Which
good idea.
Would maybe be gold and not money because, counterfeiting. And then I would probably get bolder and bolder. But I also wonder if, like, you try to draw a person, would they come out, kind of like a caricature?
They came out wrong.
Which would be like a deformity in real life. Would I dedicate myself to the craft of illustration and figure drawing? If I took a figure drawing class, would a clone of that naked person appear?
They still would have, like, weirdly long shins. And
but also, like,
their joints wouldn't quite work
when
properly.
He drew his wife as a monster, it appeared in his office. When he drew a T-Rex, it just appeared in some random woman's car.
Yeah, right. And also, he's doing black and white drawings, and they're appearing in full living color and stuff.
Yeah. So, I guess I would probably do a lot of experimentation, Death Note style.
Me too.
To see how accurate it could be, how fast it would happen, the limits of the thing I'm creating. I was wondering about what it was with microwaves and the Ghastly Grinner. Do you think it's because he drools so much, and it's the water in his drool?
The water content?
Yeah. I was like, what is the link between microwaves and the Ghastly Grinner?
Because microwaves are like magic.
As long as the paraboloids sustain the initial microwave intensity, and the focal region is sufficiently agitated...
Special thanks to Jonathan Olson for composing our theme music. You can email him at Stepwise Studios to get your own electronic and synth pop songs. Hey Ryan, what is the superhero's favorite part of the joke?
I don't know.
The punchline.
Oh no, Jeff, you got the blue goo! Rewind for your life!